The sun hadn't yet risen over South Central Los Angeles when Maria Garcia started her morning shift at the corner store on Figueroa Street. She was arranging newspapers when the headline caught her eye: "Another woman found dead in South Central." It was the third such headline she'd seen that year, but she didn't know then that it was just the beginning. The same morning, Detective Mark Rodriguez stood over yet another body. Diane Johnson, 21, lay partially hidden behind a dumpster in an alley off Florence Avenue. Her dreams of becoming a nurse had ended sometime in the early morning hours. As Rodriguez knelt beside her, he noticed the now familiar ligature marks around her neck, the killer's signature. "Same as the others," his partner, David Chen, said quietly, snapping photos of the scene. Young woman, strangled, dumped in an industrial area. What neither detective knew that morning was that they were dealing with what would become one of Los Angeles' most prolific serial killers. Chester Turner, a pizza delivery driver who knew these streets better than anyone, was just getting started. His job gave him the perfect cover, a legitimate reason to be anywhere at any time, in neighborhoods where people had learned not to ask too many questions. The city was changing in the late 1980s. Crack cocaine had transformed familiar neighborhoods into war zones. Gang violence made headlines daily. In this chaos, Turner found his hunting grounds, targeting women who lived in the shadows of society: sex workers, addicts, homeless women. But he didn't limit himself to society's forgotten. He also took mothers, students, and workers whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Turner's first known victim had been discovered in January of that year. Mary Thomas, 34, was found behind a closed grocery store on Manchester Avenue. 2 weeks later, Patricia Anderson's body turned up near an abandoned factory. Both had been strangled, both dumped in areas Turner knew well from his delivery routes. Detective Rodriguez had worked homicide for 12 years, but something about these cases felt different. The precision, he would later tell his partner. The way the bodies are placed. This isn't random violence. This is someone who knows what he's doing. At 32, Chester Turner didn't stand out in a crowd. Average height, average build, quiet demeanor. He was the kind of person neighbors would later describe as keeping to himself. His job at the local pizza place made him a familiar face in South Central, where he'd deliver pizzas late into the night. People recognized his van, his uniform, his polite smile. No one suspected that behind that ordinary facade lurked a predator. "He was always on time with our deliveries," recalled Sarah Johnson, who worked at a late-night laundromat on Western Avenue. "Sometimes he'd stick around, chat a bit, seemed like a normal guy." Sarah didn't know that Turner often used these deliveries to scout his territory, noting which women worked late shifts, who walked home alone, which areas had the least foot traffic. By April 1987, Turner had developed a pattern. He knew which alleys had broken security lights, which loading docks were abandoned after dark, which streets the police rarely patrolled. He chose his victims carefully, often watching them for days before making his move. Annette Ernest became his fourth known victim on April 13, 1987. A 26-year-old single mother of two, she was walking home from her late shift at a local diner when Turner spotted her. Her body was found the next morning behind a warehouse, less than 2 blocks from where Turner had made his last pizza delivery of the night. "The thing that strikes you," Detective Rodriguez would later say, "is how ordinary these locations were. Places people passed by every day without a second glance. That's what made them perfect hunting grounds." The investigation was hampered by the chaos of 1980s Los Angeles. The crack epidemic had overwhelmed police resources. Gang violence dominated headlines. Missing persons reports piled up on detectives' desks. Many of Turner's victims weren't immediately reported missing, a fact he seemed to count on. Inside the police department, frustration mounted. Detective Chen spent hours poring over maps, marking each discovery site with red pins. "Look at this," he told Rodriguez one evening, pointing to the pattern emerging. "All the bodies are found within a 3-mile radius. Our killer knows this area intimately." What they didn't realize was that Turner's delivery route created the perfect alibi. If anyone questioned why his van was in the area, he had a legitimate reason. If someone remembered seeing him near a crime scene, he could explain it away with a delivery receipt. Regina Washington's murder in late 1987 marked a turning point. 8 months pregnant, she was well known in the community, and her death sparked outrage. People began talking. A clerk at a convenience store remembered seeing Turner's van parked in odd places late at night. A security guard recalled him making deliveries to buildings that hadn't ordered anything. But Turner was careful. He changed his patterns just enough to avoid detection. He switched delivery routes, varied his hunting grounds. The killings continued, but the locations shifted slightly east, then south, always staying just ahead of the investigation. By early 1988, the death toll was rising, and the media had begun calling the killer the Southside Slayer. The name sent shivers through the community. Women started walking in groups, businesses installed better lighting. But Turner adapted, finding new ways to approach his victims, exploiting their trust in his familiar delivery uniform. The summer of 1988 brought suffocating heat to Los Angeles, and with it, more victims. Turner's confidence grew with each killing that went unsolved. He began taking bigger risks, sometimes striking in areas that weren't completely deserted. Anita Fishman's murder in June shocked the community. Unlike most of Turner's victims, she was killed near a busy intersection. A 31-year-old accountant working late at her office, she had stepped out to get coffee when Turner spotted her. Her body was found behind a dumpster at a strip mall, just yards from where people shopped during daylight hours. "This guy's getting bolder," Rodriguez told his partner as they examined the scene. "He's not just sticking to isolated areas anymore. He thinks he's untouchable." The investigation room at the police station had become a maze of photos, maps, and timelines. Detective Chen had created a detailed grid showing every victim's last known location, time of death, and where their body was found. Red string connected similar cases, creating a web that covered most of South Central. "There's got to be something we're missing," Chen muttered one night, staring at the wall. "Nobody's this invisible." What they didn't know was that Turner had given him more than just an alibi. It had given him intimate knowledge of the city's rhythms. He knew when shops closed, when security guards changed shifts, which cameras worked, and which were just for show. He had turned South Central into his own hunting ground, using his delivery routes to create a mental map of vulnerability. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Torres, a housekeeper at a small motel on Figueroa Street, had been watching the news about the killings. Something clicked in her memory about a regular guest who matched the general description police had pieced together. "He would come in late at night," she told Rodriguez during an interview. "Always paid cash, always asked for a room at the back. Sometimes I'd see him cleaning out his van in the parking lot at strange hours." The motel's location was significant. It sat almost at the center of Turner's killing zone. Records showed he had stayed there multiple times, always on nights when women went missing in the area. Meanwhile, Turner's personal life was starting to unravel. His girlfriend, noticing his late-night absences and unexplained blood stains on his clothes, began asking questions. He became more erratic at work, missing deliveries and arguing with customers. The careful facade he had maintained was showing cracks. In September 1988, Turner made a crucial mistake. After killing Andrea Triplett, a 29-year-old mother of one, he dropped her body in an alley he'd used before. What he didn't know was that a new security camera had been installed nearby. The grainy footage showed his van circling the block 3 times before stopping in the alley. "We've got him on tape," Chen announced, bursting into Rodriguez's office with the security footage. "It's not clear enough to see his face, but we've got the van, we've got the timestamp, and we've got the pizza company logo on the side." The investigation shifted into high gear. Detectives began interviewing every pizza delivery driver in South Central. They cross-referenced delivery schedules with the times of the killings. They checked work records against the dates women had gone missing. Turner's name came up repeatedly. His delivery routes overlapped with many of the murder sites. His work schedule matched the timeline of the killings. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence to make an arrest. The case took another turn when Tina Wright disappeared in October 1988. A 20-year-old student at a local community college, she was last seen getting into a delivery van near campus. Her body was found 2 days later, bearing all the hallmarks of the Southside Slayer's previous victims. The investigation intensified after Tina Wright's murder. Her case was different. There were witnesses who had seen her getting into a delivery van, and one of them had partial plate numbers. For the first time, investigators had concrete evidence linking the murders to a specific vehicle. Detective Rodriguez set up a task force dedicated solely to tracking pizza delivery drivers in South Central. They compiled work schedules, delivery routes, and vehicle registrations. Turner's name kept rising to the top of their list. "Look at this," Chen said one morning, spreading out a map marked with Turner's delivery zones. Every single victim was killed within his regular route. Not just the general area, the exact streets he drove every night. Turner, meanwhile, was growing increasingly unstable. His girlfriend, Lisa Montgomery, later told police about his violent mood swings. He'd come home late, covered in sweat, even on cold nights, she recalled. Sometimes he'd shower 2 or 3 times a day. He'd get angry if I asked where he'd been. In November 1988, Turner made another mistake. After killing Paula Vance, 38, he left behind a pizza receipt in the alley where her body was found. The receipt showed a delivery to an address just 2 blocks away, time-stamped less than an hour before her estimated time of death. "We need to bring him in," Rodriguez argued during a strategy meeting. "We've got enough for questioning at least." But before they could move, Turner struck again. Desiree Jones, a 29-year-old mother of 2, was found strangled behind a laundromat on December 1, 1988. This time there was physical evidence, fibers from a pizza delivery uniform on her clothing. Dr. Maria Sanchez, the department's lead forensic analyst, worked through the night processing the evidence. "These fibers are distinct," she reported. "They're from a specific manufacturer that supplies only 3 pizza chains in the area." The investigation now had momentum. Detectives interviewed Turner's coworkers, building a picture of his movements and behavior. Many remembered him taking longer than necessary on deliveries, sometimes disappearing for hours with no explanation. One coworker, James Martinez, provided crucial information. Chester would sometimes make deliveries without logging them, he told detectives. He'd say the orders were canceled, but he'd go out anyway. Always late at night, always alone. The net was tightening, but Turner seemed to sense it. He suddenly quit his job at the pizza place, telling his boss he was moving to San Diego. Instead, he moved to a different neighborhood in Los Angeles and started working at another delivery service. But his killing spree continued. In January 1989, Regina Washington, 8 months pregnant, became his next victim. Her murder sparked unprecedented public outrage. The community, already terrified, demanded action. What Turner didn't realize was that Regina's murder would be his undoing. She had fought back fiercely, leaving deep scratches on his face and arms. More importantly, she had managed to grab his delivery name tag during the struggle. Though he took it back, microscopic traces of her blood were found on the pin. "We've got DNA," Dr. Sanchez announced triumphantly. "It's not much, but it's enough to prove contact between them." The investigation moved rapidly after that. Surveillance teams tracked Turner's new delivery routes. Undercover officers posed as customers, ordering deliveries to observe his behavior. They noticed how he lingered in certain areas, watching women who were alone. On February 3, 1989, the investigation reached its critical moment. Turner delivered a pizza to what he thought was a regular customer. Instead, he found himself surrounded by undercover officers. Detective Rodriguez, who had spent nearly 2 years hunting the Southside Slayer, personally placed the handcuffs on Turner's wrists. "You've got the wrong guy," Turner said calmly, maintaining the same quiet demeanor that had helped him avoid detection for so long. "I'm just a delivery driver." But the evidence told a different story. In Turner's van, investigators found a chilling collection of items: rope matching the ligature marks on victims, a change of clothes, and detailed maps of South Central, with certain areas marked in red. They also discovered a notebook containing what appeared to be a log of his activities, dates, times, and locations that eerily matched their timeline of the murders. The investigation had uncovered Turner's pattern. He would make legitimate deliveries early in his shift, establishing his presence in an area. Then, Usually after midnight, he would return to these same neighborhoods, knowing exactly which streets were empty, which areas were unlit, and which women might be walking alone. It was all about control, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the police psychologist assigned to the case, would later explain. He chose areas he knew intimately, victims he could overpower, and times when he was least likely to be interrupted. The interrogation room at Parker Center became Turner's new reality. For 3 days, detectives Rodriguez and Chen questioned him, building their case. Turner remained surprisingly composed, answering questions with short, careful responses, denying any involvement in the murders. But the evidence was mounting. DNA analysis from Regina Washington's case came back positive. Fiber evidence from multiple victims matched the uniforms found in Turner's apartment. Tire tracks at several dump sites matched his van's unique wear pattern. Lisa Montgomery, Turner's girlfriend, finally broke her silence. She told police about the nights he would return home with scratches and bruises, the unexplained absences, the strange behavior that had become increasingly erratic. He would sometimes wake up screaming, she revealed during a tearful interview. He'd talk in his sleep about things he'd done. I was too scared to ask questions. The investigation also uncovered Turner's troubled past. Born in 1966 in Warren, Arkansas, he had moved to Los Angeles as a teenager. His early life was marked by instability and violence. School records showed a pattern of aggressive behavior and poor academic performance. By his 20s, he had several minor arrests, but had managed to avoid serious charges. The pizza delivery job had been perfect for his purposes. It gave him freedom of movement, a reason to be anywhere at any time, and access to vulnerable victims. He had turned his legitimate work into a cover for his killing spree. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered more potential victims. Women who had disappeared from Turner's delivery areas over the years. Cases that hadn't initially been connected to the Southside Slayer investigation. The true count of his victims might never be known. The impact on the community was profound. South Central Los Angeles had endured years of fear, with women afraid to walk alone, businesses closing early, and neighborhoods turning into ghost towns after dark. Turner's arrest brought relief, but also anger at how long he had been able to operate undetected. The trial of Chester Turner began in March 1990 at the Los Angeles County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, presented a devastating case that would reveal the full horror of Turner's crimes to the public for the first time. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mitchell began her opening statement. Over the next few weeks, you will hear evidence of how one man turned the streets of South Central Los Angeles into his personal hunting ground. Behind the facade of a simple pizza delivery driver was a calculated killer who preyed on the vulnerable. The courtroom was packed every day with families of the victims, community members, and media. Turner sat emotionless, wearing a gray suit that made him look more like an accountant than one of Los Angeles' most prolific serial killers. The prosecution's case was methodically presented. Dr. Maria Sanchez took the stand first, explaining the forensic evidence in terms the jury could understand. She showed how fibers from Turner's delivery uniform matched those found on multiple victims, how DNA evidence linked him to Regina Washington's murder, and how tire tracks from his van created a pattern at various dump sites. Former co-workers testified about Turner's unusual behavior during his late-night shifts. James Martinez's testimony was particularly damaging. He would disappear for hours sometimes, Martinez told the court. When he came back, he'd be different. Agitated, sweating, even on cold nights. Detective Rodriguez spent 3 days on the stand, laying out the investigation's timeline. Using large maps and photographs, he showed how Turner's delivery routes overlapped perfectly with the locations where bodies were found. The detective's testimony painted a picture of a killer who used his job to create the perfect cover for his crimes. Lisa Montgomery's testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears. She described Turner's increasingly erratic behavior, the unexplained bloodstains she'd found on his clothes, and the night terrors that plagued him. He would wake up screaming names, she testified. Names I later realized belonged to women he'd killed. But the most powerful testimony came from the families of the victims. Mary Thomas's daughter described how her mother's dreams of opening a small restaurant were cut short. Patricia Anderson's sister spoke about the last time she saw her alive, making plans for a family reunion they would never attend together. The defense, led by public defender Michael Roberts, tried to create reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of witness memories, suggested contamination of evidence, and attempted to present Turner as a hard-working man wrongly accused. But their arguments seemed hollow against the mountain of evidence. Turner himself declined to testify. He sat through the proceedings with the same quiet demeanor he'd maintained since his arrest, occasionally writing notes to his attorney but showing no reaction to even the most emotional testimony. As the trial progressed, more details emerged about Turner's methodology. He would often make legitimate deliveries early in his shift, noting women who were alone or vulnerable. Later, he would return to these areas, knowing exactly which streets were deserted and where he could operate unobserved. Dr. Sarah Martinez, testifying as an expert witness, explained Turner's psychology to the jury. He created a hunting pattern that allowed him to hide in plain sight, she explained. The delivery job wasn't just cover, it was his way of studying his territory and selecting his victims.